Well, thank you for that. That was like too much introduction. A lot of people were responsible for a lot of that stuff, but thanks a lot for that run-up. I couldn't be happier than to have the chance to have a conversation with somebody who's been a long-time friend. We've been in a lot of the same rooms. I don't think we've ever had the chance to have a 45-minute conversation, so I'm looking forward.
Not recently.
Not recently. I'm looking forward to this. With this conference and a lot of when I think about Val and I think about the journey she's had, and we'll kind of go through her journey as we have this conversation. I had a conversation years ago with Dusty Baker, who I'm distressed was not in the World Series. And it was the moment when analytics kind of came into being. And there was a lot of controversy in him being hired or not because he was not an analytics guy. And he said, leadership is always going to be important without all that other stuff. And if you think about success in sports and the idea of how sports continues to be successful, it is people that are able to do, if you can do both, that's great. But to do the other stuff is really what's important. When I think about Val and I think about your journey, I think about a lot of that other stuff, starting in the days before it was really part of the game. But why don't you first tell us what the commissioner does? I mean, what's kind of your day-to-day responsibility, job, task, and then I want to talk some about how you got there.
Okay, sure. Well, first, thanks. It's an honor to be with you, Ken, and I want to just thank the WUSBC. Is that what I heard? WUSBC. Wow, I just was thinking of sushi name, and ginger and all that. But this really is the reputation of this event precedes all of you. So it's an honor for me to be here today. I'm sorry I'm dressed a little bit less formal than some of you. In answer to your question, I was just over at a field hockey game. This is conference championship season for our fall sports. So I was over at our semifinals for field hockey, which was hosted by Temple, which is an affiliate. It's a long story. They are a member of our conference for that sport only, and they agreed to host. So I was over there, and they have the championships on Sunday, which I'll miss because I'll be at our conference women's soccer championship, which is down in Maryland. So in answer to your question, I've got a really fun job. It's an honor to do it. I've been in the position of Commissioner of the Big East now for 10 years. I'm happy to share how that came to be, but you were asking a different question. I think everybody understands probably how the NCAA is structured. NCAA is the national governing body for 1,100 schools across D1, 2, and 3. They're organized in part by the resources they put against athletics. Division I, of which Penn is a member, is 360 schools now, and they're divided up into 32 conferences. So there are 31 other people like me running a Division I conference. Our jobs are really to manage the collective athletics interests of the schools in our league. So in the case of my league, the Big East, we've got 11 schools now. We sponsor 22 sports. So we run the conference championships for each of those 22 sports. We handle compliance matters. We manage a national television agreement. We happen to be in business with Fox Sports, year 11 of a 12-year deal. Our biggest sports in our league are basketball, men's and women's. We don't sponsor football in this version of the Big East. We handle a lot of communications matters. I have a finance guy. I have compliance people who help us navigate the NCAA, the complexities of the NCAA rules, which there are many. And we support our schools in literally every way imaginable when it comes to their athletic programs. So I spend a lot of time sort of dealing with presidents of my schools who form my board of directors, our athletics directors, their staffs, our coaches. And sort of our role in the infrastructure is to manage conference business while the NCAA handles the national championships, and then our schools handle the day-to-day running of their competitions. We handle their scheduling, we handle officiating and matters like that. So it's really kind of a varied sense, a bunch of responsibilities. that involves long hours, a lot of travel. I'm also involved in NCAA matters. I've been on several NCAA committees, which often involve conference calls, now Zoom calls, meetings, and the like. I've been involved very closely over the last 4 years with name, image, and likeness legislation that the NCAA has been trying to put together. So it kind of runs the gamut.
And I definitely want to come back to NIL. And now I want to talk a little bit more about the conference and certainly how you got there. I do want to talk about women in sports and people that haven't traditionally led in sports at some point too, and then talk about leadership generally. But let's talk about the conference a little bit more, because the Big East is, I mean, in some ways it is the most unique conference, and most people know about the SEC or the Big Ten and even kind of the Pac-12, such as it was, and you can kind of understand the falling apart and the growth and maybe the takeover. But the Big East is kind of uniquely positioned, and you said in passing this version of the Big East. Why don't you explain how the conference evolved and where it is now? And then I do want to ask you about how the conference is positioned in all this uprising that's going on. Yeah.
Call it craziness. So it's a great question. So the league I'm with was founded in 1979 as a basketball conference, formed with schools principally in the Northeast that were really good in basketball but needed a league to facilitate their chances into getting into the NCAA tournament at that time. The cities, they were in big cities in the Northeast, so think St. John's and Providence College and Villanova. UConn was actually a charter member of the Big East. Boston College, I think, was a charter member. And it started out as a football league, but some of these schools started out as a basketball league, and then some of these schools had football and wanted to strengthen their football prospects. So they started adding other schools that were very serious about football. So fast forward, the Big East got very good in basketball. I think it was 1985. There were 3 of the 4 men's Final Four teams that year were Big East schools. Right. Big East won the national championship that year. Villanova. So then, what happened, I guess, in a nutshell, was that the football and basketball schools, there started to be tension between them that led to many of the football schools, or football-oriented schools, leaving the league. This happened over a period of, 10 years or so, beginning in about, 2012 or so.
And this really was, I mean, we see a lot of this now, but this is kind of unique in the world.
History repeating itself, what we're seeing now with the Pac-12. But the Big East schools back then were, again, very divided. The football schools started leaving to improve their football prospects and their financial prospects. They principally went to the ACC. So the ACC took on schools like Pitt and Louisville and Rutgers and others. And
I bet there's a bus leaving now.
Yeah. Have a safe travels.
All right.
Safe travels. Thanks for being here.
No.
They started leaving, and then it all sort of, kind of culminated in 10 years ago with the decision made by the group of schools, some of the schools I'm now representing, right, to split off from what was left of the old Big East. There were 7 in particular, the so-called Catholic 7. They made the decision to leave, to form their own new conference. They were able to negotiate with the old Big East to keep the name, to keep the intellectual property, to keep the ability to play the men's basketball tournament at Madison Square Garden. And they were able at the time to forge a brand new national television agreement with Fox Sports, which was in the process of launching FS1, which was its attempt to compete with ESPN in the national sports cable space. So all these things sort of came together circa 2012, 2013, and they added 3 other basketball schools in Butler, Creighton, and Xavier to become the new version, right, of the Big East starting 2013. And then when all that was sort of done over a quick turnaround period, they needed to find a commissioner to run all this and bring it to life, and that's where I came into the picture.
So it's kind of enlightening to think about with I'm an old Pac-12, well, actually Pac-8 guy, but to see how that's going to evolve, what's going to happen, what's the intellectual property going to be worth or not, and there's this model that exists from there. I want to personalize it a little bit more as a former student athlete as you watch this NIL activity and from the conference level you mentioned that you have some involvement and you can give some guidance. So I certainly want to know more about where the conference is guiding the member organizations within the conference. And I want to hear about your personal thoughts about NIL and what the 19-year-old Val Ackerman would have done in this kind of moment.
Well, how to start on NIL. So maybe I'll personalize it to give a context here. So sure. It was around 4 years ago. It was 2019. It's pre-COVID. We all think about things pre and post-COVID. The NCAA national office, which is based in Indianapolis, and their leadership at that time put together a working group to examine what we saw coming, which was the onset of the name, image, likeness era. We saw it coming because it had been talked about. The NCAA at that time had a prohibition on it. But importantly, some states were beginning to introduce laws that in effect said, even if the NCAA prohibits student athletes from using their images to make money, we, the state of California, are going to allow it. We're going to make it permissible in our state, regardless of what the NCAA says. And so California was the first state to do that. They passed a law, but it had a delayed effective date. I think that the effective date was 2022. So they were, in a sense, saying to the NCAA, we're going to give you a runway here to try to figure this out and allow this to happen so that we don't have to intervene. So the working group that I was asked to be part of, I was asked to chair. I became co-chair with Gene Smith, who's the AD at Ohio State. And so we had about a 25-person working group across all three divisions of the NCAA. And we quickly, maybe to get at part of your question was, we quickly agreed student athletes should have the ability to do this. In part because times had really changed. What we were beginning to see around that time was lots of young people, students included, taking advantage of opportunities to use their NIL and social media, most of all. I mean, you'd have athletes, you'd have students, and in some cases athletes with large Instagram followings, personal followings. And it was clear that that was beginning to become monetizable. So our view was that athletes should be able to do this. That said, we had concerns about how that would work in the college space, particularly how it would work in an environment where athletes, where we're dealing with athlete acquisition through incoming students as freshmen and then as transfers, and how we could keep these NIL arrangements from turning into, essentially bribes in order to attend a particular school. And so that was really it took a lot of time to think through the scenarios, and long story short, we came up with a framework. The NCAA board approved it. It was left to a separate committee, which I was also part of, to work out the details. And we were on the eve of voting on this framework in January of 21. We fought through COVID. We got all this work done. And then it was announced that the Supreme Court was going to hear the Alston case. And that was not an NIL case, and I encourage all of the students to read it. It's a very important decision. It was not an NIL case per se, but it did speak to the authority of the NCAA to make rules and restrictions on sort of student athletes and their relationship with their schools. And so when it was revealed that the Supreme Court was going to hear Alston in May, the vote was put off. Alston was decided in June, and it was a very tough decision for the NCAA, as you know. So as a result of that, in July of 21, instead of passing this framework that we had all worked up, the NCAA was basically left with what's so-called interim policy. And at that time, other states besides California were jumping in and passing NIL laws. And so the NCAA at that time said, okay, we're not going to have a national standard. We're a little bit nervous about the Alston decision and what it could mean. So if you're in a state, they said basically to student athletes, if you're in a state that has a law, or they said to the schools, more accurately, if you're in a state that has an NIL law, follow that law. If the state doesn't have a law, then here's the policy. You can do NIL, you can figure out how to do it, but it can't be a recruiting inducement and it can't be payment by the school. It has to remain third-party payment from an outside company or individual. And so that became the interim policy, and in effect still is. There have been some clarifications of that because collectives have been formed, and that was something nobody foresaw. So where are we now? Now we've got a patchwork of state laws. It's frankly become confusing for all concerned because we don't have a single national standard. That's one of the reasons that the NCAA is trying to get Congress to intervene and come up with some uniform national, here's how NIL works in any state. You don't have to follow state law, just follow this one law. And so that's in motion by the new NCAA president. And it's, there are some areas where student athletes are not protected because of reports of, activities by the third parties that are not in their interests. So that's the bad side of NIL. But the answer to the last part of your question, there's a great side of NIL, which is student athletes now have the opportunity to earn income in ways that weren't possible before.
I do want to talk about the collectives for a moment. I mean, for me, that's the most complex part of this, and maybe the part that's, frankly, the most difficult to regulate, might be the way to phrase it. And so you've seen, maybe in conference-wise, but certainly externally in committee work, the goods and the bads about collectives. Why don't you give us the continuum, and what can work well with those, and then maybe to state the obvious, what can be problematic about a collective?
Well, I guess what I would say is when I mentioned that first working group that I was part of with Jean and others, I don't want to sound immodest, but a lot of what's unfolding we predicted would happen. Yeah. We were concerned about individuals and their relationship with the athletes and whether there would be sort of exploitation going on or inducements. What we did not foresee, really the one major thing we didn't foresee was these individuals sort of forming groups, forming PACs, and pooling their money to create these NIL opportunities. So that was something we didn't think about. And so the regulation of collectives is sort of a work in process right now. They're technically supposed to be outside of the schools. That said, some states are allowing the school to have a relationship with the collective, which makes it very tricky to manage them. Interestingly, the IRS recently had a ruling that said that anybody who makes a contribution to the collective, that will not be tax deductible. If you make the contribution to the school or to the athletic department at the school, that's tax deductible. But if you make a contribution to a collective, that's not tax deductible, because they were concerned that what the collectives were doing was not consistent with the educational missions of the school, which makes the donation to the school or the athletic department of the school tax deductible. So there have been some sort of interventions here around collectives that are, I don't believe are completed. I think if Congress gets involved, that might be an area that they want to look at as they examine, what they're doing, how they're doing it, what their relationship is to the school, the tax status, et cetera. I wish I could give you, Ken, I don't have a crystal ball on how this is all unfolding. I mean, it's just sort of part of this sort of bigger challenge that college sports is facing right now in terms of legal questions around the model, how it works, and it's all really been fueled, frankly, by the handsome commercial outcomes in a few sports, at certain programs. I think I would say the unfortunate part about that is the commercial outcomes at the highest levels may be driving decisions about what happens from everybody top to bottom, D1 through D3, and it could have some harmful outcomes, I think, if not sort of thought through in a particular way. We'll see what happens.
And I guess combined with that, since we're going down this road, the transfer portal, I think that's the other big, who knew this kind of thing would evolve. And I keep trying to get you back to your 19-year-old self. I mean, I always reflect on these kinds of things. What would I have done in that moment with my, immodest or modest kind of college career? Is it a good thing for kids or not to make that kind of decision at that age? I mean, I'm kind of with you in terms of being able to make some money. That can be a good thing. the idea of when or when not to leave an institution is, I think, a lot tougher kind of decision.
Well, let me just go back to NIL, because you raised something that I didn't say when I was talking about all the benefits of NIL. It truly can be an educational experience. Right. And I think that's a positive. I mean, if you're an athlete and you want to make a deal with a company for them to use your likeness, that's a business transaction. I mean, you need to know a little bit about contract law. You got to know about tax filings, because you're going to have to pay taxes on the value of whatever income you receive, even if it's trade. That's not tax-free like your scholarship is, if you happen to get a scholarship. And so those are real positives. NIL truly is a learning experience. So that's number one. Number two, it's a time-consuming experience. And I don't know, I mean, you asked about my 19-year-old self. I mean, I was a student athlete in college. I played basketball at Virginia. It was a hard school. I had a rigorous degree. I majored in something called political and social thought, which was interdisciplinary because I wanted to go to law school, which I eventually did. But I'm telling you, between the 2-semester sport that was basketball, going to class, I was a good student. I was an honors student at UVA. I mean, that took up all my time, trying to have a modicum of a social life. So if I try to do a few extracurriculars to sort of, diversify my experience there. But if you sort of now pile on top of that what would be required for an NIL deal, that's a lot. That's a lot. And that's something that I think any athlete who wants to go down that path needs to think about. So that's that. On transfers, little history lesson here. The NCAA, up until a few years ago, had a rule that said for 5 sports, if you transfer, the base rule, if you transfer, you have to take a year in residency, which basically meant you can transfer to the new school, but you couldn't play your sport for a year. I think you could still practice, you couldn't compete. Those 5 sports were football, men's and women's basketball, men's ice hockey, and baseball. And due to a lot of pressure at the time, and the sense that was unfair at times, there was also at that time, I said that was the base rule, you could still get a waiver. So if you wanted to play right away and you had a compelling reason for wanting to transfer, you could play right away. And the NCAA was in charge of issuing the waivers. Sometimes people questioned, well, why did you give a waiver here, but you didn't give a waiver there? COVID came, everybody wanted a waiver. It was a mess. So the NCAA just said, we're just going to allow for every sport now, including those 5, one-time immediate eligibility if you transfer, meaning you can play right away, one time. Okay, that was the big exception. So what did it do? Of course, it led to more transfers. And so we saw a very significant uptick a few years ago. I can't remember exactly what year, maybe 2 years ago, 3 years ago, this came into play. Not surprisingly, you saw a very significant uptick in the number of transfers in football and men's basketball, most of all. So we could have a debate about whether that's been good or bad for the students or the coaches or college basketball. In my case, I don't sponsor football, so I can't really speak to it there. Has it been good for athletes to be able to change schools? Yeah, sure, if they felt like they were in the wrong place. How has that impacted their academic progress? I don't know. That would be a question if credits don't transfer. I mean, you asked me about my 19-year-old self. I never imagined transferring from my school. I mean, I had a really tough first year there. Our basketball team wasn't very good. It was really hard. I was homesick. I had hard classes. But it never occurred to me to say, wow, I'm going to get out of here. I didn't, I had my coach was very demanding, but it never occurred to me to leave. And so I do worry about that a little bit, right, about the mindset of, okay, this isn't working, so I'm out of here. Sometimes that's life, guys. It just isn't perfect, and it isn't what you thought, and, it's sometimes somebody up there telling you, hey, you got to work harder to make this work. And that happened to me. I mean, I learned a lot by being there for 4 years, and of course I didn't have a chance to leave early like men's players do. That's another story, the WNBA eligibility rule. But now, that's the world. The challenge, I'll footnote here for the NCAA right now is, remember I said if you transfer the first time, it's immediate eligibility. The first time, if you transfer a second or third time, you're supposed to get a waiver. And the NCAA is now fighting through the waiver rules because they set a very high bar for second and third time transfers. And so they're not issuing many of those. think it's like a 15 or 20% approval rate on the second and third time transfers. And now you're getting complaining from, people saying, wow, they didn't, issue a waiver. I read today someone suing the NCAA because they didn't issue a transfer. And so that's back to my earlier point about the legal implications of some of these restrictions are, I think they're kind of omnipresent with the NCAA, and I think you've got people of goodwill who are trying to do the best thing they can. They're trying to keep the athletes first, but it's just an environment now where the tides have shifted a bit in terms of student-athlete empowerment, what people think is fair, and again, these interpretations of these legal decisions, and what that means ultimately for the NCAA's rulemaking authority.
So I've got a couple more questions. Then I want to be able to open it up and see what people might want to ask. And these questions, I said I was going to ask you about women in sports, which is, in some ways I hesitate to do that because we have a great leader in sport. And
I would love to talk about women in sports.
But for my second name drop, Doug Williams, first black quarterback to win a Super Bowl. He says in his career, the questions he hated the most were the ones around how did it feel to be the first black quarterback. I am a quarterback, so I qualify these questions with all of that. But from your career, and this kind of gives us a chance to think about where you've been in some of the places where we've intersected along the way and thinking about the efforts. Where were we and where are we now?
Oh, well, so my brief personal story is I've been in this business now for 35 years. I started out, I mentioned I went to UVA undergrad. I took a year off. I played basketball overseas. There was no WNBA then, and that's what you did because there was a league here at that time, but it was on shaky ground, and it was not thought to be a good move. So I went overseas, came back, and I went to law school. I went to UCLA Law. And when I was there, I decided I really wanted to combine my law degree with my sports interests. I could not get a job out of law school in sports.
Yeah.
I applied. Nobody wanted to hire an untrained lawyer, et cetera. So I took a job. I went to Wall Street. I took a job at a big Wall Street firm, Simpson, Thacher, and Bartlett. Had nothing to do with sports. It was M&A and debt financings, and at the time they represented a predecessor bank to J.P. Morgan Chase. So I was doing these loan agreements. And it was a great experience, and I would recommend if you have that chance to be with a high-end firm like that, it cannot hurt you. Actually made it possible for me to get my next job, which was as a staff lawyer at the NBA. Because there were connections I made at my law firm that were right into David Stern, who was a longtime commissioner, and that's how I got into the league. So I joined the NBA as a staff attorney in 1988. Legal department was 4 people. My hiring boss, the guy who hired me, Gary Bettman's now the commissioner of National Hockey League. And I guess maybe that's a roundabout way of saying to your question, I've kind of seen it all. I mean, when I started out in the sports business, there were very few women who were executives, very few people of color who were operating at a senior level in sports. And, it was a very solitary journey for me at times. It was really hard, particularly when I was having kids, didn't have anybody at the office to talk to about what that journey was like. But at the same time, the people I worked for were good to me. My male managers were amazing mentors to me. They let me in on meetings and conference calls. They put me on boards. And it got better. I mean, I saw more women coming into the league at that time. This is now, into the 90s, the 2000s. And then, my big career break came in 1997 when the NBA decided to go into the women's basketball business, and they started the WNBA. And I was the first president of the league. A job I did for 8 years. It was amazing. I mean, it really felt like a cause because the NBA was putting women on a pedestal at that point. They wanted to promote women. They wanted to reach women. David, to his credit, understood the importance of women to the future of the game of basketball. And there I was, somebody who could help lead that. For somebody like me now, who's been at this, better, Ken. I mean, in the circles I travel in, I see many more women. I care deeply about women becoming leaders in sports. It's hard to do, for any of you, it's hard to be a leader in sports. I've given up a lot in my life to be sitting in this chair. In terms of the demands on my time, the pressures. My daughters were 4 and 2 when the WNBA launched. My husband was working on Wall Street at a big firm, and it's a hard road. You have to really be committed to your career and the sacrifices required if you want to advance. And it's really hard. I say to all of the students here, you're going to have decisions to make with how you want to, live your life. And frankly, that led, I was WNBA president, they called it president then, for 8 years. And I kind of burned out on it. I was exhausted from all the running around and gave up something good. But I had my family, that I wanted to spend more time with. And then other things started coming to me. I was, on boards, and I was doing a lot internationally in basketball with USA Basketball and FIBA, and teaching. I was actually teaching at Columbia in their sports management program. And then the Big East came calling, as I mentioned at the top. When they needed the new commissioner, I was sort of there. And then it's been 10 years now, full circle, coming back to college sports. And I really... I still find myself as the only woman in the room in a number of settings, which I've become sort of immunized to the sensation of that. I just accept that's where our world still is. And I'm not saying I love my male colleagues, they're amazing. But change is hard to come by. As you know, change is hard to come by. And I've just kind of made it part of my daily life to talk about inclusion and making sure everybody, men, women, black, white, straight, gay, we're better when we're together. We're just better together. And I just hope, we have a world that just recognizes that we're better together. And so to the extent I can contribute to that in a modest way through my work, that for me is what life is all about.
I appreciate that answer. Do you still, when you walk in a room, whatever it may be, do you still waste that second of saying, oh, I'm the only woman in here? Or
I sort of I'll do a look around.
You still?
I'll do the look around, say, okay, yeah. I got it. But
that's when people ask me, when will everything be okay? When will you know everything's okay? It's when my kids don't walk in a room and they have that moment of, okay, is there anybody else?
Well, I'll tell you when it
room?
was okay. So there's a bunch of trade associations that, affinity groups and the like, right, that help advance, some of the principles I'm talking about. And there's an organization for women who work in college sports. It's basically the trade association. And they had their national convention a few weeks ago in New Orleans. There were 1,300 women who were in attendance at this convention. I spoke at that event, 10 years ago, and it was half that. So that's when, I'm looking around saying, this is, okay, great. Now, and there were a bunch of men there too, which were great, who were great allies of this. And so, I'm very, very hopeful about this. And, most of all, what I want for the sports business, and you would agree with, I want the best people working. We have hard jobs. We want to make sure that when we step down, I'm not going to be doing this forever. I want to make sure that whoever comes behind me is going to, respect what I've done, take it to the next level. And so, that's why I'm just thrilled to see the students who are here. You all are going to be the sports leaders of tomorrow. And, you're all going to have a different path from each other, and you're going to have a different path than I took. I'll just say as a note here, for what it's worth, between the time I graduated from UVA in 1981 and the time I got my first job in sports, it was 7 years. Now, I didn't go to UVA and say, okay, in 7 years I'm going to get a job in sports. I thought I would get a job in sports tomorrow. But I just would say to all of you, don't stress about your journey here. It may be a zigzag. That's what happened to me. Life will send you this way. Your personal life will send you that way. A job opportunity you may like. You may try something new that you never thought you'd like and stick with it. You're all going to have your own story, like I have mine, about how you get to where you are. But and embrace that. Just enjoy every minute of it, because every step along the way with your journey, you'll learn something, you'll meet great people who may be lifelong friends, you may meet a future spouse or partner. I mean, and I'm glad I did that. I think I was ambitious and wanted to get to it. But I really did try to take advantage of all those steps along the way, and I just encourage all the students here to have the same mindset.
So let me open it up. As Danny's getting the mic, I will say, if people who've been in my office know, I have my rejection letter from Penn Law. I mean, you just never know where you're going to end up. I mean, this place rejected me.
Ken, I have to tell you, I have 2 rejection letters from the NBA.
Okay.
When I was in law school, I sent a letter to the NBA saying, "Hi, I'm a law student at UCLA. I would really like to work there." I didn't get one, but I got 2 rejection letters. 2 different people who later became my bosses. They had no HR department at the time. It was just like they were just, I guess they didn't know that one had responded already. But it's just ironic. And I would say that too. Sometimes a door may be closed today, but that same door could be open in 6 weeks or 2 months or a year or 5 years. Yeah. It's just the way of the world here. So you just got to be persistent.
Questions? Is that the real Troy Vincent?
This is the real Troy Vincent. Thank you so much. Just curious about your thoughts on the continued consolidation of conferences and all the changes taking place. And, you're so steady in terms of your mission and what you're trying to do.
Yeah, great, very timely question. So I'll speak on behalf of the Big East. We're very happy to be on the sidelines of all of that. I mean, I mentioned at the top, we sponsor 22 sports. Football is not one in this version of the Big East. So the moves that we've read about, effectively the looming dissolution of the Pac-12, which I can't believe is happening, we're essentially football driven. It's about that sport, the media revenues that sport generates, which are significant. And the sense of the schools involved in these decisions that their football fortunes and their future revenue fortunes were better elsewhere. And so, these moves that we've read about, Oklahoma and Texas to the SEC, for the Pac-12 schools to the Big 12, 2 more to the ACC, aren't effective until next year. So we have yet to really live or witness the outcome of these decisions and what that's going to mean in terms of, I think, travel for the athletes, cross-country trips. One thing for football, you play once a week, half the time you're at home. But if you're playing basketball and you're playing two, maybe 3, sometimes the schedule has you playing 3 games a week. We'll see how that works out. Other sports seem not to have been a major consideration when these decisions were made. So, I think everybody's kind of in a wait-and-see mode about that. We've got 11 schools in the Big East. Our travel, relatively speaking, right now is sane. We've got a kind of an eastern block of schools. We've got a Midwest pod as well. So we've got Creighton playing Providence or DC, and that's the longest trip, but it's halfway across the country instead of the whole way across the country. So, it's the talk of the business, really, why it happened, what's going to happen now that it's happened. And, is it over? No one knows. It's possible this consolidation that we're seeing could continue. And that's, something that we're all going to be keeping our eye on over the next probably, decade. So again, I'm just, all I would say neutrally is we're just grateful that we were kind of, bystanders to all of that and weren't really affected in any significant way. You're getting your exercise.
Making me make the trip. Val, more of a question for you, and I know this is probably outside your purview as commissioner of the Big East, but just given your experience and leadership in women's sports, thinking about the NCAA rights coming up for women's, there's been kind of arguments on both sides if the NCAA would be better off maximizing the value of women's college basketball rights and splitting it off from the other kind of Olympic sports. And then there are people like Carol Stiff, one of the biggest advocates for women's sports, who argue that you'd actually be hurting those other 29 or whatever the championships are. How do you think about that issue with both you as your personal perspective and then also as a commissioner of a college conference?
Yeah, hot topic here. And Carol's actually a dear friend of mine. We worked together for many years when she was at ESPN and I was at the WNBA. I don't know what the right answer is. I think I can tell you what's happening. So the NCAA is in the midst of going to market. They have, I think, an exclusive negotiating period to start with ESPN because they're the current rights holder of a package of roughly almost 90 championship events across all three divisions. The only championship that the NCAA national office doesn't run is the college football playoffs. That's managed outside of the NCAA. The TV's handled outside of it. The revenue goes to those participating conferences, not back to the NCAA. But every other sport, the NCAA manages. So that's women's Final Four, men's Final Four, although that's outside of this TV package. That's a CBS Warner Brothers Discovery television package that I think goes through 2032. So that's not part of this. But every other sport, women's basketball, the Frozen Four, the College Baseball World Series, College Softball World Series is all in this package. And the controversy of a few years ago in the Women's Championship in 21 that led to a review by an outside law firm, Robbie Kaplan's firm, noted that the NCAA women's basketball package is bundled in with all of these events and its worth has not been separately tested on the marketplace. So that's really, to your, just rephrasing your question, that's what's now the question presented. I think what's happening, the NCAA hired Endeavor as their media rights consultant, and I think what they're doing is trying to figure out what the options might be. So the question would be, if we just kept all of this together as one block, what would that get us? If we pulled out women's basketball and kept all of the rest of that together, what would that get us? If we pulled out women's basketball here and put the College Baseball World Series here and the Frozen Four there, what would that get us? I think they're trying to figure out the right combination of bundling and packaging that would get them the most revenue, but also the most exposure for everybody. And I think that was Carol's point there, was her fearfulness was that if you pull out the major properties, you're not going to have the leverage to cover the sports that don't have as attractive a following. And so that's the question. I don't have the answer. Do I have a position? Not really. I would like to see the women's basketball number. I'd like to see the allocation on that, and here's why. Because another bit of NCAA, operating detail here. Because the NCAA gets so much money from its men's basketball television agreement with CBS and Warner Brothers, the NCAA in turn pays out a portion of those revenues to conferences in the form of basketball performance units that you may have read about. And so a league like ours, we earned 15 units last year because you get a unit for every team that makes the tournament and every win up until the Final Four. So we had 5 teams make the tournament last year. We had won 10 games. UConn won the national championship. So we earned 15 units, and that results in a financial benefit to our league. And those units are paid out over a 6-year period. That's the only sport where the NCAA pays a performance unit. There's no other sport, and the Kaplan report noted that there's a unit for men's basketball but not for women's basketball. And I think the thinking of some of us is, okay, well, if we can identify a revenue stream for women's basketball, that in turn can lead to a performance unit. So for me, I like the idea of at least an allocation, because I do think it would make sense to pay a unit for women's basketball because we're doing it on the men's side. Now, because of the complexities of this, you're going to get other sports saying, well, wait a minute, if, some sports are saying we shouldn't have a unit at all for anybody. Some are saying, well, if we do it for men's and women's basketball, we should do it for baseball and gymnastics and volleyball and the like. And then you start to get into this, very complex financial equation. So I don't know where they'll land, but I would just tell you that's the goals. Revenue, but also exposure for as many of these sports as possible. And whatever combination leads to that, there'll be a lot of committees involved in making that decision. That's where they're going to end up.
Got time for one more, I guess.
Two more.
I'm not going to, two more. Okay.
Three more.
Two more.
Hello, thank you so much, both of you, for being here. This has been such a great discussion. I'm Elise, I'm a JD MBA student here. So my question is on the topic of women's basketball. I think we all know about Brittany Griner, and it poses a larger conversation of why Brittany Griner had to go to Russia to make money playing basketball in the first place. So I'd love to get your opinion on what you think it will take for women's basketball, the WNBA, to become a commercial success so the women can make a living so they don't have to go to places like Russia to compete. So is it private equity? Is it more viewership, sponsorships? Would love to get your thoughts on that.
Can I add, because a couple of people asked me to add some more beef to that, and the ownership structure especially. I mean, you mentioned private equity, but and the relationship with the NBA, are there pluses and minuses to making some changes in any of that kind of thing that could get to the point where overseas play is a luxury, or a personal decision?
It is it's still they don't have
Still,
to go.
yeah,
Just
still
to be clear, you
personal.
don't not have to go overseas.
I guess
it's no one's making, but that's, so maybe I'll just start. The WNBA, because I was at the ground floor of this, plays in the summertime. That was the NBA's decision, and it was intended to maximize the television possibilities for the league. And in fact, when the league launched, we had national television networks, national television arrangements in prime time for 3 networks. NBC, the broadcast carrier, ESPN, and then Lifetime. We were experimenting with a women's network. So we played in the summer. It meant we didn't have to compete with the NBA, college basketball, the NFL, baseball, NHL, et cetera. The season was sort of Memorial Day to Labor Day. That has since grown. When we set up the contracts, we said the players will be allowed to play elsewhere in the winter. So we set it up deliberately as non-exclusive player contracts. And we thought that was actually a positive, that the players could be in the WNBA in the summer. That was the extent of the NBA's interest at the time. But they could go overseas in the winter and make a second salary. And so many players over the years have done just that. The irony of Brittany Griner is that Russia actually was one of the best countries for women's basketball players over the years. They were the country that paid the highest salaries and treated their players the best. And players like Diana Taurasi and Lauren Jackson and Tina Thompson and others, Sue Bird, they all played in Russia. Brittany's problem, I think the problem was she had terrible timing, deciding to go back to Russia when the war was starting. And so it was a terrible situation, and I think everybody involved is thrilled and that she was fortunate enough to be released. So that's part one, that's the history. The answer to your question is it's fan support. I mean, it's going to be fans who support the WNBA or the NWSL or whatever the next women's team sport league is in ways that can be monetized. That's how the NBA grew. I started at the league when the NBA was just taking off. I mean, they were not selling out when I started at the NBA. Games were on tape delayed. And because the players were so appealing and the rivalries were so appealing, and fans got so interested, that created the demand. Tickets were getting sold. They were able to charge higher prices. Sponsors were getting interested because the buildings were full. People were watching on television, which drives up advertising rates. And that drives up rights fees. And that money goes back to the players. That was the NBA model. If you make enough money, you can share it with the players, and it's now whatever, 50-50 or 51-49 or whatever the split is in this collective bargaining agreement. So my view, if that's the model, my view is if more people come out to support women's basketball, if they're paying a lot of money for their tickets, if sponsors are spending a lot of money to be associated, If television networks are paying big rights fees because they know a lot of people are watching, that's what it's going to take to drive up the salaries in a way that may not make a player feel like they want to go overseas to supplement their WNBA income. I think the last thing I'll say is I believe the top salaries, they've grown since we started. I think the top salaries now, if you're a top player in the WNBA for whatever it is, a 4-month season, I think you're making probably $250,000. It's probably my guess. And then, if you're, appealing, from a marketing standpoint, you're probably making some endorsement money on top of that. So we'll see what happens. I hope that's what happens in the future, that it just continues to grow in a way that benefits the players.